Sometimes the history of modernist art, especially as it unfolded in Paris, can feel a bit like a soap opera or a sitcom, with all the intersecting relationships and cast of recurring characters. We've already been introduced to some of the key personalities in season 1 of the 20th century modernism, figures like Nijinsky, Debussy, Stravinsky, and most importantly, the Captain Kirk overseeing the whole modernist enterprise, Serge Diaghilev. Diaghilev, I'll remind you, was the impresario, the head honcho of the Ballet Russe, and responsible for bringing together some of the most important composers, designers, and choreographers of the early 20th century. Now, in the chronological trajectory we've been tracing over the course of our class, we've entered the period of the Great War, from 1914 to 1918. This will signal an enormous shift in the aesthetics of modernist art, a season 2 of our modernist TV show, which we'll go into more detail in the second half of this class after reading week. It also means we're going to add some fresh characters to spice up the soap opera drama. And with that, please welcome to the stage the 23-year-old Jean Cocteau, an energetic, flamboyant, and creative young man who, admittedly, was also rather privileged and bratty, though full of big ideas. Cocteau was looking to make it big, baby, to bring his ideas into the theater, and more importantly, to insert himself into the avant-garde circles of Paris. I'll mention now that he was a skilled artist, although Picasso drew this, but you should look up Cocteau's sketch work, which is actually very similar to Picasso's sketch work. And he eventually became a great filmmaker as well, especially his trilogy about the mythical character Orpheus. Those are worth watching, but those are from much later. This is early in Cocteau's career when he was still a young man in his early 20s. So to make it big, who better to hitch his wagon to than to the man at the top who was making modernist magic happen, Diaghilev. In 1912, the year before the Rite of Spring and 2 years before the war began, Diaghilev had taken a chance on Cocteau with a ballet called Le Dieu Bleu, the Blue God, for which Cocteau came up with a hokey Orientalist scenario loosely inspired by Hindu mythology. That ballet, which starred Nijinsky, was poorly received by the public. One night after the show, Cocteau was returning from dinner with Nijinsky and Diaghilev, who were both in a disappointed mood. Cocteau writes, Nijinsky was sulking, as was his custom. Diaghilev was making fun of my absurdities. When I questioned him about his reserve, I was used to praise. He stopped, adjusted his eyeglasses, and said, Étonne-moi, astonish me. Diaghilev's simple yet direct injunction set off something in Cocteau. The flashy young man was all razzle-dazzle. He talked a big talk and knew how to promote himself. While Diaghilev saw through this act, he also sensed the potential in Cocteau to create something truly great. And so he left the young man with this challenge: to put his money where his mouth was and create something truly original that would astound the impresario. So Cocteau took the next few years to regroup and collect his thoughts, but partially because the war had broken out in 1914, and he served as an ambulance driver, tending to wounded soldiers in Belgium. But during this period, he began to formulate a project that would eventually become his first important theatrical endeavor, the ballet Parade. Also during this time, Cocteau was introduced to the two collaborators who would help him realize this project. Composer Eric Satie, whom he met in 1914, and artist Pablo Picasso, whom he met the following year. So he cultivated deep friendships with both of these men, but it was no doubt the novel pop cultural themes that Cocteau had in mind for Parade that attracted both Satie and Picasso to the collaboration. Both the painter and the composer straddled the divide between highbrow and lowbrow. That is, between the avant-garde world of refined art, patronized by the wealthy and the elite, this is the highbrow, and the cheap world of mass market entertainment, patronized by the common working class people, the lowbrow. So Picasso had rather unsophisticated tastes in entertainment. As a Spaniard, for example, he enjoyed bullfighting. He was also a fan of the circus, and circus people, especially acrobats, are recurring subjects in his paintings, as you can see in this 1905 painting of a family of acrobats. Saltimbanque is the French word. He doesn't glamorize them like some Cirque du Soleil fantasy. The best acrobats of this time period tended to perform as part of a fixed circus in urban centers like Paris, while second-rate acrobats traveled from town to town to scrape together a living. Just like the stigmas surrounding present-day fairground workers, the infamous carnies, circus people were considered low-lifers and associated with prostitution, crime, poverty, and all the dirtiness of this itinerant existence on the open road. You can see how their costumes in Picasso's paintings might give the false illusion of gaiety when seen at a distance during a performance, but in reality, the bright colors are fading and the fabric is getting worn out, and they're covered in the dust of the road. See, some of them have the same grayish color. The people themselves aren't strong and handsome tightrope walkers, but rather pale and sickly. And the fact that the family has forced their children to participate in the act would have been seen as very unrespectable from the vantage point of bourgeois turn of the century morality. Yet Picasso endows these social outcasts with a kind of melancholy nobility in his painting. The fact that he would paint them at all elevates them to the same status as the mythological or aristocratic figures who typically featured in art. Since the circus is now, in the present day, a less common form of entertainment, we tend to view such artworks as charming and nostalgic. But this painting was deemed inappropriate at a 1910 exhibition and removed from display. While it's difficult to comprehend that sense of shock today, you have to keep in mind that these traveling performers were in the lowest rung of society. Satie, the composer of Parade, was himself something of a lowbrow performer, though not quite as impoverished as those dusty circus people. While he's primarily known today for his highly eccentric avant-garde works, he made a living by accompanying cabaret acts in the Montmartre neighborhood of Paris. Montmartre, which you may know from the film Moulin Rouge, became the stomping grounds for poor avant-garde artists, beginning in the second half of the 19th century. It's situated on a hill overlooking Paris, with the cake-like Sacré-Cœur Cathedral at the very top, which is the highest point in the city. Now, because of its elevation, Montmartre was very breezy, and so a prime spot for windmills that were used for grinding grain and pressing grapes. You can see one behind Satie in that portrait there. This explains the name and the logo for the Moulin Rouge nightclub. Moulin Rouge means red windmill, and they have this giant fake windmill at the front, at the facade of the club that's all lit up. But there's also some real windmills, old-fashioned wooden windmills that you can still see today if you visit Montmartre. As you probably know, the Moulin Rouge was a nightclub that put on racy floor show acts with chorus girls doing the can-can to expose their shapely legs and frilly underskirts. It also became the hangout for courtesans and call girls to pick up male clients. Montmartre, in the nearby red light district of Pigalle, had a seedy reputation. But this area was also associated with cutting-edge modernist movements. As painters and composers, including Satie and Debussy as well, who was friends with Satie, they were based here in Montmartre. Now, Satie worked as an accompanist at the now legendary cabaret Chat Noir, or Black Cat, which you probably know from this iconic poster, which you may even have hanging in your dorm room. Most cabarets were on the smaller side, just a bar, some tables and chairs for the audience, and a small stage or just a designated performance area of the floor with an upright piano. So you couldn't really have big burlesque shows with rows of chorus girls doing the can-can in these venues like you could at the Moulin Rouge. Typically, the acts were performed by chanteurs, that is, singers of popular tunes, the females chanteuses. The small, intimate spaces encouraged interaction between the singers and the audience, especially since the audience didn't consist of high-paying patrons in plush velvet seats, but a bunch of everyday people who had come to drink and have a good time. They would often participate in the shows. Perhaps the chanteur would ask the audience to sing along on the refrain of a well-known song, or teach them the refrain and then have them join in. There would also be banter and even heckling and fights, though usually between the audience member, hopefully not with the chanteur or the chanteuse. It was a much more open and relaxed atmosphere than the stuffy opera or concert hall, or the Ballet Russe itself, which was patronized by the wealthiest and most stylish members of the Paris elite. So this was the kind of setting that Satie felt most at home in. And he lived and worked in Montmartre as a young man during the 1880s and 90s. Much of his compositional work at this time involved arranging popular songs for cabaret chanteurs to sing. The repertoire of the period was typically very bawdy and suggestive, or else overly sentimental and tear-jerking. Most of it was very poor quality and gimmicky, with juvenile lyrics and stupid yet annoyingly catchy refrains. The publishers of this music, and again, this is how it would have been disseminated at the time through sheet music, and these publishers who published this sheet music were more concerned with the sales of their sheet music than with cultivating great music that would last forever. Yet Satie was able to elevate this genre in the cabaret songs that he composed. He proved that the so-called lowbrow art needn't be low in quality, but could be a source of beauty. This is best demonstrated in his cabaret song Je te veux, or I want you in French, which was published in 1903. Let's give that a listen.
J'ai compris ta détresse, cher amoureux, et je cède à tes vœux. Fais de moi ta maîtresse, loin de nous la sagesse, plus de tristesse, et j'aspire à l'instant précis où nous serons heureux.
As you can hear, this is an absolutely gorgeous tune with this yearning melody that's continually reaching upward. It's coupled with this buoyant waltz accompaniment. That's a 3/4 time. Dun, 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 dun. Love this song. Now, popular songs of this period, much like pop songs today that you would hear at a dance club, these songs weren't simply listened to from the comfort of your seat in a concert hall like you'd listen to Schubert. No, these songs were almost always in dance meters that could be played in ballrooms for couples to waltz to. So you could either listen, play it at your piano, just the way that you would play a Lady Gaga song on your iPhone. I almost said your iPod. Geez, what was this, 2003? Or they could be danced to at a dance hall, just like you would dance to Lady Gaga at the club. So Satie arranged Je te veux in versions for solo piano and other instrumental combinations so that it could be played as a dance number rather than as a cabaret song to be performed. Again, it's another instance of lowbrow popular entertainment being more participatory than highbrow classical art, where there's a clear distinction between the audience sitting motionless in the auditorium and the trained ballet dancers on stage. That distinction was broken down in lowbrow art so that the dance and the music and the participation and the performance all become one. So with his ballet Parade, Cocteau wanted to break down the divide between highbrow and lowbrow, or more accurately, to let the popular entertainment of the day invade the sacred temple of high art as represented in elite institutions like the Ballet Russe. Now, when I say that Parade was Cocteau's ballet, what I mean is that Cocteau was a kind of creative director of this project, like a mini Diaghilev impresario who oversaw every detail of this collaboration. While he didn't compose, choreograph, or design, he ensured that the collaborators were on the same aesthetic page and all contributing in their own ways to the themes of this ballet, another modernist incarnation of Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk concept, the total work of art. Now, remember how Rührich and Stravinsky had traveled to an artist's retreat in Russia to brainstorm for the Rite of Spring? Cocteau organized a similar trip to Italy for him and his collaborators to get inspiration and work on the project together. However, Satie had composed most of his score early in the creative process, and therefore he stayed behind in Paris, while Cocteau traveled to Rome with Picasso, who would be designing the costumes and set, and the Ballet Russe dancer Léonid Massine, who would be choreographing the ballet. Cocteau served as their leader and was also responsible for the scenario of the ballet, its libretto, though many of his ideas were eventually vetoed by his fellow collaborators or by Diaghilev, as we'll see. So here's what Cocteau wrote in the introduction to the 1917 edition of Satie's score. He says, quote, "3 music hall numbers make up the show: the Chinese conjurer, the acrobats, the young American girl. 3 managers do the hustling. They urge the crowd in fantastic terms to follow the parade into the theater and crudely try to make them understand. Nobody enters. After the last number in the parade, the exhausted managers collapse in each other's arms. The Chinese conjurer, the 2 acrobats, and the young American girl emerge from the empty theater. Seeing their manager's supreme effort and its failure, the 3 try to explain to the crowd that the performances take place inside the building." Now, why have I italicized parade, and why am I pronouncing it so pretentiously? That's because I don't want you to get it confused with the English word parade, meaning a public procession with floats and marching bands. In French, the word parade has another connotation related to the circus. As you could probably work out from Cocteau's description here, a parade is a sideshow that's performed in front of the circus tent or in front of the theater to give the public a sample of the acts inside. The pointillist painter Georges Seurat famously depicted a parade in action in this painting from the late 1880s. And you can see the circus managers to the right overseeing everything. Now, these performers in a parade are typically the second string performers in the circus, since the real talent would have refused to perform for non-paying customers like this. So the characters in this ballet depiction of a parade are similar to the acrobats in Picasso's paintings. They're not only traveling carnies, but they're the lowest tier of carnies who would have to coax people to come inside. Not a very forgiving or respectable job. What makes their efforts particularly pitiful is the fact that they fail in their attempts to draw in a crowd into the tent or into the theater. The public is confused about the nature of this performance and aren't aware that this is only a taste of the full-scale show taking place on the other side of the curtain. Though it's important to note that the would-be audience of passers-by aren't featured as dancers or extras in the production. Rather, it's the real-life audience in the auditorium who are watching the ballet parade, who represents the confused onlookers who don't understand what the parade is. Cocteau seems to be making an allegorical statement about avant-garde art. But like the parade performers, modernist artists, who often live in poverty akin to Picasso's acrobats, those modernist artists aren't able to connect with the audience. The message modernists are trying to convey in their art was often lost on the general public, who were turned off by the surface of the art, the confusing or shocking subject matter or novel techniques. Audiences at the time failed to interact with the art in a deep or meaningful way. That is, to enter into the circus tent of modernism, if you will. And so they remain on the outside, scratching their heads at the strange performances they've just witnessed. So the whole ballet you can think of as a kind of allegorical or symbolic representation of what it was like to be a modernist artist at the turn of the century. Ironically, though, and also unsurprisingly, there was a lot of head scratching as well as booing and jeers at the premiere of Parade the Ballet in Paris in 1917. The message was indeed lost on the chic Parisian audiences, who were used to the exotic Orientalist or Russian fantasies that the Ballet Russe usually astounded them with. The piece was shocking in a way that was different from the Rite of Spring premiere, though. In that case, it was Nijinsky's utterly unballetic choreography that weirded out the opening night audience. In the case of Parade, it was the lowbrow subject matter that the audience found unacceptable, just as Picasso's acrobat painting had been removed from that art exhibition I mentioned. So nowadays, decades after Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and other pop artists of the 1960s onwards began featuring comic books and commercial products in their artworks, we don't bat an eyelid if a professional artist incorporates the everyday world of popular culture into their paintings. But this was one of the first times that mass market lowbrow entertainment, so not folk culture, which had a kind of an authenticity, but we're talking, dime novels, the circus, the cinema, cheap, lowbrow entertainment that wasn't authentic and of the people, but was pumped out, cheap, easily manufactured, and widespread. This was the first time that that mass market entertainment had penetrated into high art. And this was a line that you simply did not cross at the time. Again, it's hard for us to imagine this since we've seen everything and nothing shocks us. But remember as well that the audiences of the Ballet Russe were there to escape the humdrum ordinary life. There was a war raging, and they wanted an escape from 20th century reality, to travel to an exotic harem or witness a pagan ritual. So the Parade collaborators were, in a way, trying to give them an escape, some fun, light vision of fun entertainment, nothing too heavy, nothing with sacrifices or people dancing themselves to death. But they didn't see it that way, the patrons, the Ballet Russe patrons. What they got were these grotesque and stylized imitations of actual variety theater, circus, and cinematic entertainments that were taking place outside the theater, all over Paris. They would have seen similar acts advertised all over Paris, on garish posters plastered to every street wall. The typical elitist Ballet Russe audience member would have purposefully avoided these kinds of cheap thrills, which they associated with dirty slums and low-lifers. But now that unrespectable demi-monde, as they call it, the low world, that they'd rather not think about, was being thrust in their faces. The closest present day equivalent that I could think up would be a version of Parade where instead of the Chinese conjurer, we had a dancer who resembled some David Blaine, illusionist, endurance artist, doing those stupid feats of holding your breath or what is sitting at the top of a pole or whatever. Or instead of the little American girl, we had a Hooters girl or some stripper or something doing like a wet t-shirt contest. And then instead of the acrobats, if we had two WWE wrestlers doing a stylized SmackDown dance. You could think up your own present day alternatives and perhaps even work them into your own production or choreography of Parade. to try and recreate that same sense of shock, to see lowbrow, cheap entertainment stylized and placed on the ballet stage. That'd be a great project that I recommend. Feel free to steal that idea. So it's that kind of cheap and sleazy associations of Hooters or WWE that will help you understand what a 1917 audience might have felt. Although, of course, there was a fair bit of snobbery going on amongst these people. So maybe you don't want to tap too much into what those audience members felt, because you would have to place yourself high above the common folk. At any rate, as with Picasso's painting, we in the present day might think that the three acts of Parade, that is the magician, the little American girl, and the two acrobats, are charming and nostalgic, no matter how hard we try and recreate what the opening night audience felt. But that audience, the Ballet Russe audience, would have instantly recognized that these were parodies of real life entertainments that less fortunate audiences would frequent. I've already mentioned circuses, so we're going to place the acrobats aside for today. It's also one of the more boring dances. It's the more traditionally balletic dances. It looks like a normal pas de deux. So we're not going to talk about that one so much today. Also, it doesn't seem like there was a specific real life acrobat act that Cocteau and his collaborators were trying to recreate. But the Chinese conjurer character is clearly inspired by a stage magician who went by the name of Cheng Ling Su, or I know many of you speak or understand Chinese, would be Cheng Lian Su. Now, I was initially hesitant to discuss this character in Parade, who seems to be a yellow-faced mockery of an Asian person, as you can see from the Picasso's costume design on the right. Such racist entertainments making fun of the, quote, Ching Chong Chinaman, these entertainments were widespread at the turn of the century, especially in North America. Given the large number of Chinese, Taiwanese, and Korean immigrants and descendants in our class who appreciate Western classical music, I realize it can be painful to see the way classical music of the past has stereotyped East Asians. But there's actually a deeper parody going on here that might make the Chinese conjurer character a little more palatable and even satirically humorous. So give it a chance. So Cheng Ling Su, as you can probably tell from this photo on the left, was not actually Chinese, but a white man named William G. Robinson, who hailed from the New York City suburb of Westchester County. So Robinson stole his act, the tricks he performed, his traditional braid style. It's called the queue, that long ponytail, which was worn during the Qing dynasty by men. That, as well as the costume he wore, and even practically the name, Cheng Ling Su itself, all that he stole from an actual Beijing-born magician who went by the stage name Qing Ling Fu, or Jin Ling Fu. Qing Ling Fu, by the way, was even mentioned in an Irving Berlin song, From Here to Shanghai, which was published in 1917, the same year as Parade. Irving Berlin, who's one of the greatest American songwriters of the early 20th century, will come back in a moment, so remember his name. Now, eventually, there was, I kid you not, a magical showdown between the fake Chinese magician and the real Chinese magician to see which of them was the better conjurer. Qing Ling Fu, the real Chinese magician, lost the contest and returned to his homeland. And Cheng Ling Su, the fake Chinese magician, grew to fame and popularity. Partially, this was due to his aggressive advertising, which included pasting hundreds of bills on walls in the cities where he was touring, as I've attempted to reproduce with this slide. Now, if you're angered by how this story turned out, with the white man in yellowface not only coming out on top, but destroying the career of an actual Chinese immigrant, just know that Cheng Ling Su, or rather William Robinson, Cheng Ling Su received his comeuppance. In 1918, the year after Parade, he was performing the stunt depicted in the poster in the lower left hand of this slide. in which he pretended to catch a bullet in a plate. One of his assistants would actually load the gun, but not fire the gun. Chung-Ling Soo would have a bullet in his palm, and he would make it look like that was the bullet that he caught. Now, that night in 1918, the trick went horribly wrong. And one of his assistants, the one who actually loaded the gun, actually fired the bullet. Chung-Ling Soo, who always pretended not to speak English and conducted interviews through a translator, he suddenly exclaimed on stage in English, "Oh my God, something's happened. Lower the curtain." He died the following morning. All of this is to say that Chung-Ling Soo and his hokey Orientalist antics were extremely well known to the Parisian public, who would have likely been annoyed to bits at seeing his smug expression plastered on every wall when he was in town. Again, this is what turned off the opening night parade audience, that this kind of cheap entertainment with its fake Chinese facade was being elevated to high art within the context of a ballet. So the choreography by Leonid Massin, who also danced the part of the Chinese conjurer in the premiere of Parade, went so far as to reenact certain tricks that Chung-Ling Soo was known for. Cocteau, remember the artistic director who came up with the idea for this ballet, Cocteau helped out with the choreography by showing Massin the kinds of gestures that circus and variety show entertainers would use during their acts. These elaborated hand motions that magicians use to distract you while they perform their sleight of hand. And then Massin would stylize these gestures that Cocteau showed him to make them look more dance-like. In fact, Massin wasn't originally a dancer. He was an actor, and in the ballets he would perform these character roles that were more about pantomiming than about doing impressive Nijinsky type dances. So he was used to this kind of dance, and his choreography you could actually think of less as dance than as sort of elevated pantomime. So this was right up his choreographic alley, so to speak. This kind of creating stylized version of real life gestures to create a character, a very colorful character through these gestures. So Massin didn't perform any actual prestidigitation, but rather he mimed signature tricks that Chung-Ling Soo and other stage magicians, especially fake Chinese magicians, were known for, including breathing fire and making an egg appear out of his foot after he's pretended to swallow it. But again, he doesn't actually have an actual egg on stage. He just shows it an invisible egg in his hand. Makes the trick a lot easier, I can tell you that. So the exaggerated makeup, and which, by the way, Picasso designed the makeup, this exaggerated makeup and the grotesque facial expressions may seem on the surface to be a yellow face caricature of a Chinese person. But Massin here is making a mockery of Chung-Ling Soo's fake Orientalist persona, not poking fun at Chinese immigrants. On the contrary, Massin said in an interview that his choreography was, quote, a parody of the usual pseudo-Oriental entertainer with endless tricks up his sleeve. Now, Satie also drew on Oriental stereotyping in his themes for the Chinese conjurer's dance, though it's not as clear whether he's in on the same ironic joke as Massin. So let's take a look at what he composed compared to popular Chinese and Chinatown themed songs from that era. Songs like Irving Berlin's From Here to Shanghai, which I mentioned has a shout out to Qingling Fu, that is the real Chinese magician. So Western composers in these popular tunes would often employ a 5-note scale called the pentatonic scale to give an impression of Chinese music, which is indeed based on these 5-note scales, penta meaning 5 in Greek, pentatonic. You can easily reproduce this scale at the piano by simply playing on the black notes, which repeat in groups of 5 at the keyboard. You can picture the 3 note and see it on the slide there, 3 notes, then 2 notes, 3 notes, then 2 notes, those groupings of black keys. However, rather than actually engaging with authentic Chinese classical or folk melodies, American and European songwriters and composers would simply invent their own fake Chinese melodies using the pentatonic scale, which is what Irving Berlin does in the verse and the introduction to From Here to Shanghai. I've shown here which pentatonic scale Berlin uses, which is called the D minor pentatonic scale, though he only uses that for the melody. It's D, F, G, A, C, and then the extra D on top makes for 6 notes, but the D is repeated, so there's only 5 with D, F, G, A, C, not counting that second D there. But look at the second measure of the vamp. It's called a vamp, which is a little a motive, an ostinato that you play over and over until the singer, who's doing some kind of pantomiming or hamming it up on stage, until the singer is ready to sing, and then which is why it says till ready, because then he nods at the accompanist or makes some gesture and then launches into the song where it says voice. So in the second measure of the vamp, see how even though he's following the pentatonic scale in the melody, let me play the melody. So even though that is pentatonic, Berlin inserts notes that don't belong to the D minor pentatonic scale. Notes like E, B flat, and C sharp. Again. Though it'd probably be much faster. Over and over, waiting for the singer to come in. Now, this isn't another instance of chromaticism. Remember, chromaticism was when you have your 7-note major or minor scale, Western major or minor scale, and you pull on the other notes that aren't in that scale. So this may seem like chromaticism, but it's not. Rather, it's an imposition of Western harmonies and Western major and minor scales, the notes that belong to the regular 7-note scale. It's an imposition of that Western system onto a pseudo-Chinese pentatonic melody. That makes it sound melodically Chinese, but it harmonically grounds it in the Western tonal system. So Satie does something similar in the opening bars of the Chinese conjurer's music. Let's take a look at this reduction of the full score for 2 pianos. This is a little bit like those piano vocal scores we looked at for opera, but here the whole orchestral score is reduced to 2 pianos. So you could play during rehearsal, so you don't have to have the full orchestra there. And it makes it easier to study a work and look at melodies and rhythms and textures without being distracted by instrumentation. So he begins with this little call and response melody in G major pentatonic. So here's the G major pentatonic scale with the extra G on top there, but for just the 5, it's G, A, B, D, E, D, B, A, G. And Satie has this little call and response melody that goes. So aside from the little grace notes, those little decorative little notes that I played before each of the main notes in the melody, aside from those grace notes, which don't belong to the pentatonic scale, Satie pretty much sticks to the 5 notes of the scale. Yet he also anchors it on a G major harmony in the lower 2 staffs. Again, like Berlin, he's imposing a Western chord onto a pseudo-Chinese melody. In the last 4 measures there, the ones with the red and blue circles, he modulates to a B major pentatonic scale for the melody, which is that ascending and descending quarter note line in the middle of the staff. So here is the B major pentatonic scale. The extra B on top, or B, C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp, going down, F sharp, D sharp, C sharp, B. And here's the melody in the middle line there. So you can see it has 3 of the 5 pentatonic pitches, and the other 2 are taken up by the accompaniment. But sure enough, also in the accompaniment, which are the upper and the lower staffs, he inserts pitches that don't belong to the pentatonic scale. There's an E in the upper staff's ostinato to get an E major chord, and then there's a G natural in the lower staff's ostinato to get a G major chord. Again, this isn't chromaticism. This is using pitches from the Western major or minor scales and inserting them on top of a pentatonic melody to get tonal harmonies. So let me play for you now a clip from both Irving Berlin's From Here to Shanghai and the opening passage from the Chinese conjurer movement of Parade. Don't worry about all the music theory that I've just spouted. Rather, try to just focus on the pentatonic melodies of both these pieces. I'm sure you'll recognize the sound of this orientalized musical stereotype from old cartoons and movies. But just a heads up, Berlin's lyrics are rather derogatory in the way they refer to Chinese immigrants in Chinatown. Even worse is the way that the performers on this recording insert their own made-up Chinese nonsense words. In no way am I condoning this kind of harmful essentializing, especially given the history of racism toward East Asian immigrants in North America, which continues to the present day. But I think it's important to see how casual this kind of racism was 100 years ago as we continue to make progress today.
I've often wandered down where? To dreamy Chinatown. Down where? The home of Ting-a-ling. One long sing sound, think it easy.
So I hope you could hear how Satie is rather close to Irving Berlin in his Orientalist musical stereotyping and his imposition of Western harmony onto pseudo-Chinese pentatonic melodies. But is he making fun of Chinese music itself, the way that Berlin is? Or is his approach closer to Massine's? That is, could it be that Satie is not so much making fun of Chinese immigrant music, but the kinds of hokey Chinese stereotyping practiced by songwriters like Berlin? Satie's music is full of irony and musical jokes, as we'll see later. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's on the same level as Massine here, but it's harder to tell. So I'll let you ponder that as you listen. But as a kind of response or critique of all this gimmicky Chinese mimicry, I want to propose a final project theme for those of you interested in Parade. I think it would be fascinating to retell the story of the two magicians, Chengling Su and Qingling Fu, as a ballet or a pantomime accompanied by Satie's score. Each musical number could reenact an episode from this strange saga, and your choreography could comment on themes of race, immigration, and yellowface imitation. And then, as you've seen, while poor Qingling Fu is forced to return to his homeland, there's still a bit of karmic justice at the end of the story, since Qingling Su, or rather William Robinson, gets what's coming to him. So I think this will work especially well for Parade, since Parade deals with themes of fakery, fakeness, and inauthenticity, especially in the choreography that we get. Massine's choreography for the acrobats is miming acrobatics on the ground. They're not actually on tightropes or swinging from trapeze swings. They're pretending to do that, and it's obvious they're pretending, and it looks a little bit silly on the ground. The same with the magic tricks, that he pretends to hold the egg and put it in his mouth and pull it out of his foot, or pretends to blow fire, but it looks ridiculous because it's not actually occurring. So those levels of fakeness and inauthenticity are also found at multiple levels in the story of these two magicians. For one, both magicians, Chinese and American, are not real magicians. It's stage magic. It is false. You know it's false going into it, that it's pretend. But then we get these deeper levels of fakery, that the white magician is pretending to be Chinese. And not only that, not only stealing the identity, the racial and cultural identity of the other magician, also stealing his tricks. And the tricks themselves are fake. You know what I mean? There's all these different levels of fakery that I think could be really fascinating in a production. So if you want to talk that over with me, I'd be happy to talk about that. Feel free to steal that. On the subject of stealing, steal that from me. You have my permission. So returning to Cocteau's scenario, after the Chinese conjurer has pretended to blow fire from his mouth, like I said, he's replaced by the little American girl, who comes out wearing an oversized bow to make the dancer look smaller by comparison. Now, at the turn of the century, the US was beginning to emerge as the world's chief exporter of popular culture, mainly in the form of mass-produced media like silent film and pop music. Europeans especially were huge consumers of American culture, which they associated with a popular vision of the States as a land of towering skyscrapers, organized crime, and the adventurous life of the Wild West. These are the kinds of fantasies that Europeans would have seen on the big screen in detective dramas, gangster flicks, and cowboys and Indians movies. So the spunky little American girl in Parade encapsulates all those European fantasies of America as filtered through popular cinema. In fact, MUS340's choreography for the role is a rapid succession of gestures and poses pulled from silent film, as if the dancer were reenacting a montage reel that's been pieced together from 1-second clips taken from several dozen movies. In his autobiography, MUS340 describes the premiere performance of this role by the Ballet Russe dancer Maria Chabelska. He said, "She bounced on the stage, crossing in a succession of convulsive leaps, her arms swinging wildly. Then she did an imitation of the shuffling walk of Charlie Chaplin, followed by a sequence of mimed actions reminiscent of the perils of Pauline, jumping onto a moving train, swimming across a river, having a running fight at pistol point, and finally finding herself lost at sea in the tragic sinking of the Titanic." Now, as with the Chinese conjurer character, the little American girl makes reference to real-life figures in pop culture at the time that the snooty Ballet Russe audiences would have turned their noses up at, or else secretly admired. Now, Chaplin, the greatest comic film actor who ever lived, you surely know, or surely should know. MUS340's choreography incorporates his iconic duck walk and cane twirl that he would execute as his recurring little tramp character with the little mustache. The Perils of Pauline will be less familiar to you. That was a 1914 series of 20-minute film shorts about a feisty go-get-em gal played by Pearl White. Amazing stage name, Pearl White. Her character, Pauline, would find herself in the kinds of dangerous adventures that MUS340 describes in that quotation. And at the ends of episodes, she was often tied up somewhere or hanging from a cliff, hence the term cliffhanger for a suspenseful ending that requires you to wait for the next segment to see how it all turns out. Though I mentioned these are not TV shows. Television was not a thing. You'd have to go to the theater to see these. And in fact, at some point in World War I, they were showing French troops on leave. They were showing them all 20 episodes at once so that they could get them in before they went back to the front. They were crazy about the Perils of Pauline. So everybody would have known these episodes, even in France. So as the dancer pantomimed this rapid sequence of snippets from Chaplin and Pauline and other movies, she was supposed to give the appearance of vibrating or shimmering, like the flicker of a film reel as it's projected on the screen. In fact, Satie even gives us a musical equivalent of the cinematic flicker at the opening of the Little American Girl's music. So look how the violins play the same melodic contour as the flutes and second violins. But for each eighth note that the flutes and second violins play, the first violins play 3 16th note triplets. So if the flutes play da 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 da, the violins will play Diddle, 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 diddle. So this sonically recreates the visual illusion of film, in which a series of still images is rapidly shown in sequence to the viewer, who registers them as a continuous movement, like a flip book. However, a moviegoer, especially in the early days of cinema, might notice a slight flicker where the projector is changing from one still to another. Very rapid, but it's still kind of noticeable. That's why they were called flicks. Movies were called flicks in slang because of the flicker. Likewise, each pitch in the violin part in the Satie piece is executed in rapid succession, so that every group of 3 pitches might blur together for the listener into 1/8 note, just as individual film images blur into smooth motion. Yet the listener still registers a subtle sonic flicker as the violinists quickly reiterate each pitch. But the most unusual musical feature of this dance is the ragtime passage that Massine referenced in our earlier quote. Among the exciting American trends being imported to Europe at the turn of the century was this infectious new dance style of dance music that originated among African American communities in the States. Ragtime is such an irresistibly danceable style because of the way it plays with rhythm. This is a feature that originates in the African rhythms brought over to America by slaves. The strong beats in a piece of ragtime, rather than being emphasized with a heavy downbeat chord at the beginning of a measure, are constantly obscured in the music through a technique called syncopation, which we discussed in relation to Stravinsky last week. So your brain senses that those strong beats aren't being emphasized and insists that they be filled in. That's what gives you the urge to move when you listen to this kind of music, or any of the offshoot styles of popular African-American music that emerged over the course of the 20th century after ragtime, things like jazz, blues, rock, funk, hip-hop, etc. Your body is trying to fill in those thwarted strong beats of syncopation. Da 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 da. Scott Joplin's Entertainer. So just as Massine was referencing existing films in his choreography, Satie quotes a published ragtime called That Mysterious Rag, composed by none other than our old friend Irving Berlin, who wrote it in 1911 with fellow songwriter Ted Snyder. Though I just want to stress here that Satie wouldn't have known Berlin's From Here to Shanghai, which was published the same year as Parade, though there were plenty of other fake Chinese pop tunes that he could have known, but he wouldn't have known From Here to Shanghai. But That Mysterious Rag, which again was published in 1911, had been performed as part of a show at the Moulin Rouge in 1913, and Satie would have either heard it at the Moulin Rouge as part of that floor show, or he would have seen the sheet music. So let me play you here a clip I put together that compares a 1911 recording of That Mysterious Rag with Satie's ragtime passage from Parade. Though, as a warning, don't expect them to sound exactly the same. Satie isn't so much quoting the song exactly as paraphrasing aspects of its rhythm and harmony.
Did you hear it? What? Were you near it? No. If you weren't, then you've yet to fear it. Yes. Once you've met it, well, you'll regret it. Why? Just because you never will forget it. Mysterious rag. While awake or while you're slumbering, you're saying, keep playing that mysterious rag. Are you listening? Yes, keep listening. Look. They're whistling that mysterious rag. Sneaky, sneaky, ever melodious, mysterious rag.
Now, I should add that Berlin's original, or Satie's copy for that matter, isn't a particularly good example of a rag. There isn't nearly as much syncopation as in more authentic rags by Black composers like Scott Joplin, who are constantly playing with the beat. Berlin and his co-writer, who isn't as popular, Snyder, Berlin is likely using that term rag to mean a popular song in general. These different genres of popular music were still feeling out their stylistic boundaries at the turn of the century, and it wasn't always clear how to musically define each type of dance form. At any rate, we can see some rather tame syncopations in Satie's paraphrase of the chorus to That Mysterious Rag, which I've reproduced here again in the two piano reduction. So where the numbers usually are to show you the time signature, the meter, you'll see a C with a line through it. That means we're in something called cut time or 2/2 time, number 2 over number 2, like I show in purple. So there are 2 beats per measure, and the half note, that is the empty note head, like the ones at the very bottom staff, that gets the beat. So in the first measure, Satie uses these groupings of 2 staccato eighth notes to emphasize the back half of each beat, which is labeled with the plus sign that signifies the word and. So you count it 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and, which I've showed in red there. So here's what that sounds like. So this is a very common ostinato in ragtime and other popular music. This bap 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 bap, where the back half of each beat is emphasized. So at measure 6, Satie reasserts the regular meter with those 4 equal quarter notes on 1 and 2 and, like this. 1 and 2 and. But on the following measure, I've circled in blue this little syncopation where he ties over the very last note of the second half of beat 1, again, the and of beat 1, the back half, he's tied that over to the first note of beat 2. This means that the beginning of beat 2 isn't articulated in the melody, and we have to feel it in our body. So here's what it sounds like. Can you feel your body wanting to fill in the 2? Here, I'll beat out the 1 and the 2. Here's 1, 2. 1, 2. Again. Hear how my hand tapping the 1 and the 2, it tapped out the 2, but the melody didn't play a new note on 2. It was tied over from the previous beat, and my hand filled it in, whereas your body might have filled it in as well, this need to move. And finally, at the 2 measures circled in green at the bottom, the melody doesn't come in until the back half of beat 1, again, the and of beat 1. So we have this very noticeable hole at the beginning of those 2 measures. So you get rest and 2 and rest and 2 and. Satie even accents all those other quarter notes, the and 2 and. So everything is emphasized except the downbeat, which we fill in again with our bodies. So here's another interesting passage from the Little American Girls Dance. You might be able to tell from this kind of parabolic shape in the upper staffs that this is supposed to represent an ocean wave. So if you remember from that Massine quote that one of the actions that the little girl mimes is sinking with the Titanic, which was a tragedy that was still fresh in the minds of the Ballet Russe patrons. The sinking of the Titanic was 1912. Although I don't think it figured as much in Massin's final choreography than Cocteau had pictured originally when he was coming up with this character. But this is a vestige of that the original concept of the little American girl as being pretending like she's on the Titanic. You know what theme they should have quoted is no. Though I don't, if you check the years, I don't think that was written yet. So we're not going to talk about this or listen to it. This is the dummy slide for the attendance. So you can read it across there. The letters that are underlined, remember, are lowercase. You have to follow upper and lowercase. And you read from left to right, excuse me. So if some of the letters go up or down, that's okay. Just remember reading left to right. So I'll read it for those of you who are hard of seeing. As always, it starts with forms.gle, the last three letters of Google, / uppercase V as in Victoria, uppercase L as in loser, uppercase E as in Edward, uppercase Q as in Queen, uppercase X as in xylophone, uppercase J as in Joe, lowercase f as in Frank, uppercase A as in Amelia Earhart, uppercase P as in pet, lowercase e as in Edward, lowercase t as in Tanya, uppercase K as in King, the number 4, lowercase s as in Sarah, uppercase Q as in Queen, lowercase j as in Joe, and the number 9. Every time I something with something, I see you. That is why my heart will go on. What a great Canadian. Sorry, there's been a lot of American shout outs today, so let's have one Canadian shout out to my hosts here in Canada. All right, let's move on. That's enough pop culture. So by the way, Irving Berlin would develop into one of the best songwriters of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He's my personal favorite songwriter of this time period. And he'd go on to compose classics like White Christmas, Blue Skies, God Bless America, and the songs for the musical Annie Get Your Gun. But in the 1910s, he was still feeling out the art of songwriting. And so he inevitably wrote some rather idiotic, gimmicky, and subpar ditties, as we've heard with both From Here to Shanghai and That Mysterious Rag. But that's all the more reason why it's such a shock to hear it in a work like Parade. Satie, as we know from his cabaret song Je te veux, was an excellent composer of popular music, and he would have sensed just how bad That Mysterious Rag is, how it's catchy because of its incessant repetition, not because it's any good. Now, there wasn't a lack for quality popular songs in 1917. Rather, Satie has paraphrased this song precisely because it's in such bad taste. In the spirit of Cocteau's scenario, he wants the music to sound authentically cheap, like a second-rate dance hall band playing whatever was the equivalent of top 40 music at the turn of the century. He even features the brass section in his ragtime arrangement to imitate an early jazz ensemble. The trombonists play these slide glissandos at one point, like the ones we heard in The Rite of Spring, but this time it really is meant to evoke jazz or circus music. So while Satie's evocations of Chinese music are by no means authentic, as I pointed out, he may not want them to sound authentic in the first place, but at any rate, his imitations of rag-tinged popular music are supposed to come off as genuine, as if an actual jazz band playing an existing American tune had been cut and pasted into the ballet's musical accompaniment. So on the subject of cut and pasted sound, I wanted to briefly address the strange noises that you no doubt heard either on the video or the audio recording of Parade. Satie's score for Parade includes parts for unusual percussion, not really percussion, but things like a pistol, a police siren, a typewriter, a clicking lottery wheel, that is this kind of like the Wheel of Fortune wheel, but a smaller version that they would have at a fairground that you twirl and win a prize, win a fish, and also a set of tuned glass bottles. Now, while this seems very avant-garde on Satie's part, these unusual sound producers weren't actually his idea. They were imposed on him by Cocteau, who wanted to incorporate real-life non-instrumental noises into the ballet. Cocteau was no doubt influenced by the Futurist movement, which we discussed in our first lecture. Recall that the Futurists embraced the sights and sounds of modernization, especially the noisy din of 20th century urban life. So in the end, it was Diaghilev who nixed the noises entirely. He eliminated them from the 1917 Ballet Russe premiere of Parade. Though, as we discussed, the opening night audience was weirded out enough by the other borrowed aspects of the performance, that is, all the references to lowbrow music and popular entertainment. Some of the sounds were restored in the later productions, such as the 1921 Ballet Russe revival of Parade, and they're usually included in concert performances of Satie's score, if an orchestra just plays the score, no ballet. So they're a fascinating and whimsical feature of the score, but the noisemakers, like I've said, are less attributable to Satie than to Cocteau. In fact, Satie actually said that he viewed his score only as, quote, a background to throw into relief the noises which the playwright, that is the librettist Cocteau, considers indispensable to the surroundings of each character with his own atmosphere. These imitated noises are, in music, of the same character as the bits of newspaper, painted wood grain, and other everyday objects that the Cubist painters employ frequently in their pictures. So as we've observed, the ragtime excerpt could also be thought of, like Cocteau's noises, as a musical equivalent to the bits of real-world materials that Cubists incorporated into their artwork, alongside painted or drawn portions. Satie must have had a work like this 1912 Picasso collage in mind. It may have actually been this one he had in mind. He even mentions bits of newspaper. You can see a bit of newspaper in the lower left, and printed wood grain, that is, the false layer applied to cheap wood to make it look like expensive oak. But what about the other 90% of Satie's score that isn't the pasted collage bits like the ragtime or Cocteau's noises? The composer himself is rather shocking in his modesty, as he admits, like no other composer would, that he views his score as a mere background to throw into relief Cocteau's noises, that the noises are the main sonic event and not the music. Why does he devalue his music in this way, making it sound like a sonic equivalent of that literal wallpaper that serves as the backdrop of Picasso's collage? In fact, in the years after Parade, Satie experimented with developing a kind of music that would eventually be called ambient music or background music. He himself called it furniture music. You're not supposed to sit and contemplate this music like a Wagner opera. Rather, like wallpaper or furniture, it's supposed to fade into the background, providing some unobtrusive sonic ambience that merely sets the mood, like the soothing music piped through the speakers of spas and shopping malls today. So the main techniques that Satie used to achieve this quality of inconspicuousness in his music are already on display in Parade, particularly in this fantastically nondescript passage from the acrobat's dance. Satie sets this section as a waltz, which was a common musical and dance form used to accompany circus acrobats. Just give a listen to the famous 1867 popular song, The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, which goes, he floats through the air with the greatest of ease, the daring young man on the flying trapeze. But while those trapeze waltzes are typically very buoyant, bouncy, and bubbly in order to give the musical impression of defying gravity and floating through the air, Satie ironically gives us a very plodding and static waltz. Let's give that a listen. So this static quality is due to three main musical features here. First, there's that droning organ, which you'll hear better if you listen with headphones. It's hard to hear if you're just listening with your computer speakers. Now, a drone is simply a pitch or a chord, though typically just a single note, that is held continuously. For the premiere, Satie actually had a specially constructed organ with only 2 notes, as that's all he needed in this section. The organ drones on an octave E for 15 measures. You can see it droning here. It's given a different name, but that's an organ there. And then it ascends a half step to an octave F for 4 measures. And then it drops back down to an E for 9 measures. This drone would seem to be like a sonic horizon or a foundation for some musical activity, but we don't get much musical activity, as you heard. That brings us to the second feature of this section, that intentionally boring and humdrum ostinato in the strings. So the violins and viola play A, B, and E over and over. Etc. So they do switch their harmony to B flat, C, F when the organ changes to F for those 4 measures. That sounds like this. So I guess we get some variation, but then as you'd expect, we go right back to A, B, E when the organ drops back down to the E, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so maybe the flute can give our ear some musical interest, which we're desperately craving by now, which brings us to the third feature of this section, the use of repetition in the melody. While the flute isn't playing an ostinato, the use of exact repetition at the beginning of each phrase makes it just as boring and inactive as the ostinato. See how in the first phrase, it ascends through D, E, and A twice, like a broken record. And on the second phrase, it descends through B, A, and F sharp twice. This is purposefully uneventful and static music, the origins of the minimalist music of the later 20th century composers like Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and John Adams, if you know those names. Satie is intentionally creating sonic wallpaper here, and he's doing so rather ironically and humorously. It's fascinating that the same techniques he's employing are found in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, but with vastly different results. Stravinsky strategically stacks his ostinati and folk song themes in layers that gradually pile up and get louder, reaching unbearable and chaotic climaxes. And of course, we saw how Stravinsky employs greater rhythmic variety than Satie, how Stravinsky inserted jarring syncopations on dissonant chords, or constantly switched between different meters so that the listener's sense of a downbeat is abruptly thrown off. Satie, though, sticks stubbornly to the basic 3/4 waltz meter without varying the rhythm with any fun syncopations, nor does he add any new themes to pile on or new ostinati that would compete with each other and form dissonant harmonies. Now, Satie told us he viewed Cocteau's noises as the cubist elements in his score, the sonic equivalents of the found paper objects that Picasso stuck in his paintings. But I think we can start to pick up on another influence from Cubism in the music itself, that is not the borrowed passages, but in static passages, like this one that we listened to in the Acrobat's dance. Satie was very taken with the visual style of his Parade collaborator Picasso, and you get the sense that Satie is attempting to musically approximate the flattening out of space in Cubist art. Recall from our first lecture that Cubist artists represented multiple angles and perspectives of an object, but did so on a flat canvas. Even on a 3-dimensional sculpture, like these fantastic cardboard costumes that Picasso designed for the showbiz managers in Parade, even in these, Picasso maintains his sense of flatness. You can see how objects that would be seen in the background are sticking out from the manager's costumes as if they're in the foreground. It's as if the space between the American manager on the left and the skyscrapers behind him, or the space between the French manager on the right, who is an obvious parody of Diaghilev, by the way, and the trees behind him had totally disappeared. These managers have become one with their backgrounds. As with Satie's music, there's no differentiation between backdrop and subject. It all flattens out into a blocky cubist assembly. Even Satie's angular ostinato in the strings recalls the sharp, acute, and obtuse corners of the theater entrance that Picasso designed for the set. You can see, I wonder if you even measured the angles, if it would be the same angle. No, that's not how music, you can't measure music with a protractor, sorry. Of course, it's important to remember that Satie completed most of his score before Massin, Picasso, and Cocteau traveled together to Rome on their field trip to work on the visual components of the ballet. So it's very, very unlikely that there are any passages in Satie's music that are direct references to Picasso's set and costume designs for Parade. But as he explains himself, Satie is responding to the visual aesthetics of Cubism in general, as well as Picasso's earlier works. So to conclude, this unity of vision across the different theatrical media makes Parade a perfect example of a modernist Gesamtkunstwerk, with the musical and design components working together on the same plane, the same flattened cubist plane, that is. It's just another one of the many ways that the collaborators of this work, Picasso, Satie, Massin, all working under Cocteau, came together to express the same themes and subjects of this work, but through their own media. It makes this work a magical and exciting and delicious little whimsical work that I hope you find entertaining, funny, and bizarre. And with that, I'll leave you guys today. I promised a shorter lecture. I hope you enjoy and at least get some of a little break during reading week. And I hope that you at least start to think about your final projects. You have 5 incredible works, 3 ballets, 2 of which are very, very short, as I'll point out again, and 2 operas. And I've also given you some ideas for projects that you could, you're of course, like I said, welcome to steal from me if you can't think of a good idea yourself. So I would recommend start at least choosing a work and thinking about the basic structure of what your project will look like during reading week. And with that, I will leave you and join you again live in person on Tuesday afternoon to discuss one of the greatest works. I know I say this for everything. I've chosen the works, but so they're all the greatest works. But one of the greatest works of the 20th century opera, Alban Berg's Wozzeck, which is a very, very different work from Parade. So until then, toodaloo.